It's time we ask ourselves the age-old question, what the fuck is going on in Texas? It's easy to ignore what other people are going through when it's far away from you, but if it was you going through 3 days of having no power in the dead of winter, you'd probably be feeling some feelings about it, right? And you look at the news and you see a bunch of very different explanations. And I don't even just mean the people who have an agenda. You have people obviously saying, oh, the wind turbines have frozen. We've invested too much in green energy, and that's the problem. You also, of course, have people on another side of the spectrum saying, well, it's actually the natural gas pipelines and it's actually the fossil fuel system that has failed us. I'm not here to talk about either of those. Those aren't equally stupid, by the way, because it's clear that fossil fuels have failed more substantially than green energy by a factor of 5 or 6, apparently. So they're not equivalent, but I'm not here to talk about that because I fell down a rabbit hole trying to figure out why is it even like this in the first place. It was so confusing to get these very different explanations, not just from political partisans, but you even read news articles that focus entirely on the material aspects, on the fact that pipes are frozen, generators are frozen. But wait a second, don't they have power in like Norway and like Alaska through the dead of winter? Like, does everything freeze there? And then you see everybody talking about ERCOT, and once you realize they're not talking about EPCOT, you think, wait, what is ERCOT? What is that? Is that an energy company? Or is that a government board or something? Well, let's fall down the rabbit hole together, and I'm going to try to make this quick. And I'm not pretending to be an expert on this. I am not an expert on this. I'm just a guy who fell down a rabbit hole and found it really interesting to learn about the way an energy grid can work in a unique place like Texas. As a therapist, there's also a psychological interest that I have in this whole giving multiple explanations for something, because other people have pointed this out. For example, Slavoj Žižek in his book The Borrowed Kettle references a Sigmund Freud quote about how in dreams there's this kind of logic where you can say, oh, I didn't steal your kettle, I just borrowed it, and also I never even took your kettle, and also it was my kettle. And like you can have these different rationalizations for something and how it proves that there's actually an irrational basis for it because the different rationalizations don't actually line up. And then Zizek talks about that with the Iraq War, the reasons for going into Iraq and how it's similar. There were a lot of different justifications. None of them really panned out. It's similar here. You're hearing multiple different rationalizations that don't add up. But you would be forgiven if you missed the fact that there were different explanations. Because what a lot of them have in common is that there is too much demand and the supply doesn't meet it. So you can hear that and say, well, that makes sense. Too many people need too much power at the same time and there's not the supply to meet it. But then you have to wonder, why is there not the supply to meet it? That's not such a simple thing. Here's our first example of an explanation. A senior director at ERCOT, Dan Woodfin, saying, it appears that a lot of the generation that has gone offline today has been primarily due to issues on the natural gas system. That seems pretty clear-cut, but wait, what are those issues on the natural gas system and how much is a lot? Well, we find out in the same article. Production of natural gas in the state has plunged due to the freezing conditions, making it difficult for power plants to get the fuel necessary to run the plants. Natural gas power plants usually don't have very much fuel storage on site, experts said. Instead, the plants rely on the constant flow of natural gas from pipelines that run across the state, from areas like the oil and natural gas producing Permian Basin in West Texas to major demand centers like Houston and Dallas. Okay, so did all the pipes freeze? What's going on? In the Wall Street Journal, we see a similar thing. The grid operator said it lost about 34,000 megawatts of supply as freezing temperatures forced natural gas and coal-fired power plants offline in quick succession. Again, we have to come back to the question, don't they have these same kinds of pipelines and stuff in Norway, Alaska, all the other places in the world that regularly get temperatures much colder than what Texas is dealing with? Why is this a problem? Well, the slowly failing New York Times, I guess, they're not failing very quickly, but the slowly failing New York Times actually had some good context that And I do have a lot of criticisms of the New York Times, genuinely. But they actually had some really good context. They interviewed William Hogan, the architect of this strategy that Texas uses and that they adopted, it looks like, in 2013. After significant problems in 2011 that we'll get to. William Hogan describes the system that they use as not convenient, not nice, but necessary. And those are the words you want to hear. You know, it's very, very like cold, hard facts and manly. It's very masculine. He seems like a very strong, masculine man. It really gets your blood pumping to hear that when you're, extremely freezing in the cold and don't have any power and stuff. But in a nutshell, my understanding is Texas essentially works on a grid separate from the rest of the United States. And it looks like this goes back further than 2013. So for years, energy experts argued that the way Texas runs its electricity system invited a systematic failure. In the mid-1990s, the state decided against paying power producers to hold reserves, discarding the common practice among the United States and Canada of requiring a supply buffer of at least 15% beyond a typical day's need. Well, that's interesting, because didn't we just learn from one of the directors of the Energy Board in Texas that it's really hard to store energy? I thought the problem was that it was hard to store energy. But here we're learning that the state decided decades ago against paying or sort of subsidizing energy companies to hold energy. So it looks like what he meant when he said it's hard to store energy is it's expensive. Here we're seeing an interesting way that the free market is essentially tackling a very material, real-life issue, which is how to stay warm in the winter. And, keep your electronics running, sometimes life-saving electronics. Many people have already died because of this weather. I mean, people die. These things have already happened. So we're getting, a little closer to the problem. A little closer. Let's try to understand it in a little more depth. So if we listen to an actual expert in electric grids rather than some idiot on YouTube, we see no one's model of the power system envisioned that all 254 Texas counties would come under a winter storm warning at the same time. It's putting major strain on both the electricity grid and the gas grid that feeds both electricity and heat. Okay, so no one planned for it. Essentially, no one planned for it. And there's this defensiveness in that quote. But let's keep going. There should be better reasons. Texas produces and consumes more electricity than any other state. Did you know that? It's reasonable. Everything's bigger in Texas. But it is the only state in the continental United States that runs a standalone electricity grid, as we learned in the failing New York Times, was designed to keep the state's energy system independent and isolated from other markets. Texas first, you know what I'm saying? The problem? It means during critical weather events like the storm, most of Texas cannot connect to other grids which are connected and draw from each other when needed. Overall, around 4.4 million customers were without power. We learned from the same article that ERCOT is not subject to federal oversight and is largely dependent on its own resources. So, that's always good. You always want to be an upstarter, pull yourself up by your bootstraps when it comes to managing the electrical grids. So let's get into some more depth about ERCOT. Unlike other U.S. electrical grid operators, ERCOT does not have a capacity market. Payments made to operators to ensure power needs in coming years. So they don't pay operators of power plants and generating facilities to ensure power needs in coming years. They don't make those advance payments. They don't subsidize, essentially, because those payments sometimes just go to nothing. Sometimes they don't actually generate the power in future years. Instead, regulators use scarcity pricing, which I'm going to try to explain, but I don't fully understand. Instead, regulators use scarcity pricing to ensure reliability, but that can cause real-time prices to soar due to shortages, and soar they did. Next day power for yesterday, at the ERCOT North Hub, jumped to a record of $1,489 per megawatt hour, and the average was $26 in the same hub in 2020. That's such a big jump. But the thing is, that changes instantly, and you don't necessarily know that that's how much you're going to pay on your bill. So what a lot of these electric companies have been doing is actually asking their customers to cancel their plans, because they know that that's better PR than not asking their customers to cancel their plans and having the customers find out that now they owe thousands of dollars because of the way things work in Texas. This is a Texas electric company called Griddy with a nice, cool, hip Like my mic is shaking, it's getting angry. Gritty has a nice, cute little website with their pink and blue. And look at that. Texas, we hope you're staying safe. And yep, things suck right now. Holy crap. Like, as far as bad messaging goes, I had my mind blown. I don't expect anything from companies. And I had my mind blown by how bad that was. This is horrible messaging. Gritty is asking people to leave before they get a big bill. Because the way Gritty does it, this is weird, but you pay $10 a month or $9.99 for energy, but then you also pay the wholesale price of energy on the market, which means sometimes you're paying much less than what people would be paying on a more like consistent plan, but sometimes you're paying much more because when demand surges in a time like this, you're paying the wholesale price on the market, not regulated and not mediated by the sort of government investments I was just talking about that would, subsidize energy companies to hold energy so they don't have to raise their prices with scarcity pricing. Like, scarcity pricing is like a Band-Aid on a complicated system. It doesn't actually solve it. So right now what we have is the blood gushing through the Band-Aid, and Gritty is asking their customers to stop working with them so they don't have to pay thousands of dollars and hate Gritty forever. But I hope people will probably hate Gritty forever anyways. People certainly seem mad at ERCOT for their statements. Like, people are genuinely just not understanding what ERCOT is saying. Because look at this tweet ERCOT put out this morning, Wednesday morning. We know this is hard, which again is so bad. Like, you don't do that. That's like me as a therapist being like, I know what you're going through with the trauma you're talking about with me. It's like, no, I don't. Don't pretend you do. Like, you don't. But people are actually confused because ERCOT it doesn't explain themselves well. But that's interesting too because it's all based around euphemism. We know this is hard. We continue to work as quickly and safely as possible to restore power. We gained some megawatts overnight, but are back to 14,000 megawatts of load shed. Lost East DC tie imports due to Midwest power emergency. We hope to reduce outages over the course of the day. Now, I know you can't fit a lot of characters into a tweet, but you can do threads, you can do multiple tweets, and they don't have to make it this opaque, but they probably don't fully understand how opaque they're being. But load shed is just this, they certainly understand what they're doing there. That's a fantastically opaque euphemism to basically say cutting off power. So load shed, we're shedding the load, is literally human beings without power freezing. So that's what load shed. I think the East DC tie imports, someone explains, I think East DC tie imports is connecting to other places, basically. It's not just that the operators weren't paid enough in advance to store energy. It's also that the whole system isn't winterized enough. Padding for the pipes, different kinds of winterized procedures. You have like these examples from past problems where they've said, oh, we should have winterized like this. You can see these photos here, different ways to winterize the panel interiors and this and that. And this is from a report on outages that occurred in 2011 in Texas. So while extreme cold weather events are obviously not as common in the Southwest as elsewhere, they do occur every few years. And when they do, the cost in terms of dollars and human hardship is considerable. Regarding winterization, the report says entities in both categories, both generators and natural gas producers, report having winterization procedures in place. However, the poor performance of many of these generating units and wells suggests that these procedures were either inadequate or were not adequately followed. So cool. It's like you have them in place, but like they're not working. So great job. And regarding reserve levels, this report says, however, the massive amount of generator failures that were experienced raises the question whether it would have been helpful to increase reserve levels going into the event. This action would have brought more units online earlier, might have prevented some of the freezing problems the generators experienced, and could have exposed operational problems in time to implement corrections before the units were needed to meet customer demand. This is a report about the 2011 events. This information is known, and we will hopefully see it be improved because, look, there are all these new investigations being announced and so on, but you don't need to wait for those because you got some random guy on YouTube explaining to you some basic stuff. Basic stuff meaning what I can understand. This is what led me down the rabbit hole. This is the document ERCOT put out a few days ago, their like initial document where they're shedding load. They're dropping 10,000 megawatts. So the interesting thing here and what led me down the rabbit hole is where they reference legislation. They say here, Energy prices across the system are clearing at less than $9,000, which is the current system-wide offer cap pursuant to this legislation. I'm trying to understand what offer caps are. It's basically a way of limiting how much people can offer to pay operators for energy. And if you don't limit that, then people can offer to pay too little so that the operators won't be able to make money and stay in business. But the problem is, the costs are essentially passed to the consumers instead of the government subsidizing those operators, in my vague understanding. I went to the legislation and I tried to read through it, and basically what you end up seeing is what they're referencing here is a whole system where they have a low system-wide offer cap and a high system-wide offer cap. And at the beginning of the year, they've made it so they always start with the high system-wide offer cap of $9,000 per megawatt hour. And then once the operators reach a certain amount of revenue, they change to the low system-wide offer cap. And that's to make it so that people aren't paying too much once enough profit's already been gathered by the operators. But the problem is, we've reached that point sooner than they would have wanted, because now, because of demand, we reached that point, making it so that the cap should go down very low. But if the cap was down that low, there isn't even enough capacity because of the material problems with the pipelines and the wind turbines and so on. There isn't enough capacity to actually provide at those lower prices. So what they're doing instead is shedding load. Their language here just struck me as so interesting. The way they say, the commission believes this outcome is inconsistent with the fundamental design of the ERCOT market. Energy prices should reflect scarcity of the supply. If customer load is being shed, scarcity is at its maximum, and the market price for the energy needed to serve that load should also be at its highest. That's a lot of shoulds for a place that believes in a free market. How free is this market? The CEO, in an interview with a Texas publication, said this, which I find very interestingly walking the middle line between all the different rationalizations we talked about. He said, supply and demand are the two key elements, and with electricity, you can't really store a whole lot of electricity. You've got to make it and use it at the same time, and the physics of it dictate that you have the supply and demand at a certain frequency. And if you get too far out of balance, you can have the system, wires burn, you have catastrophic failures. And that's what our job to avoid, and that's what's our job, to avoid to deliver power safely. And that's what's our job to avoid. I assume there's a comma there in his mind. To deliver power safely and reliably without that kind of issue. Sorry, buddy, I'm not sure all of this is physics related. And look, you can have problems with what they're doing right now, but you need to also look into the background of the situation. I hope this video was a somewhat good jumping off point and maybe an interesting exploration. What I really see this video as is an analogy to the time when Chang makes a PowerPoint in Community.
Chang, how's it going with the PowerPoint for the city council meeting?
Good question.
So I did my best. I just wanted to make a short video about this topic. I really spent 3 hours in this rabbit hole. So I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy who wanted to learn about something interesting. And, it's the intersection of economics, free market economics versus what's the role of government, as well as energy, and as well as just the practical, human values that we care about of just comfort and enjoying our ability to live in peace. And you can dislike government interference and government regulation, but do you really want to end up with a 501c4 like ERCOT, running the electrical grid? 501c4 is a nonprofit like a 501c3, except they can do more lobbying, which is when you pay to have legislation changed, essentially. So we have the people managing the electrical grids kind of being a part of the government, but kind of not. And I don't think that's a good gray area. And I'm quite a fan of gray areas usually. So thanks for watching. Check out my other videos. They're about totally different stuff that I actually have some knowledge about. And have a good rest of your day. And if you are living in Texas, advocate for things to be changed, because this is obviously not a sustainable system. And we don't need more investigations from government bodies. They already did them, and they already came out with the good answers. We just need to listen to them. So listen to people who know what they're talking about. And now this person who doesn't know what he's talking about is done talking.